Well, good afternoon, everybody. If those of you seated a little further back would like to come down, I think we'll have a fairly intimate conversation today with our attendees in public. We also are joined by an online community today, and the recording will be available after the event also. My name is David Leonard. I'm the president of the Boston Public Library, and I will be your moderator and host for today's program. So without further ado, welcome to your library. And we are thrilled to continue our partnership with the Museum of African American History in bringing you today's program on the heels of their wonderful award ceremony last night, at which the winner and two finalists participated. And so once again this year, we are thrilled to have this year's winner of the Stone Booker Prize here with us, Thulani Davis. Thulani Davis is a professor and a Nellie Y. McKay Fellow in the Afro-American Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and author of My Confederate Kinfolk, a 21st century freedwoman discovers her roots, a poet and longtime writer for theater, film, and journalism. Davis has been a recipient, in addition to last night's award, of a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Writers Award, a Pew Foundation National Theater Artist Residency, and a Charles H. Revson Fellowship on the Future of New York City. And so the format of our one-hour program today will be a presentation from Dr. Thulani Davis first, followed by conversation between herself and myself, and then we will take questions from both our in-person audience here, as well as from our online audience that will be moderated by our great program staff member, Erica. And so without further ado, please welcome to the podium the Stone Book Award winner, Thulani Davis.
Thank you. I'm going to give you a visual tour of my book. I was telling David that I tore a tendon in my right foot on my way to go to Mississippi to do research, and I was trapped in my apartment, and I had been doing all this work, writing the book, and I said, I just want to know what it looks like. So I made these maps. They've been perfected over time, but it gives you kind of a quick view of what the book is showing. During the war, the first place the Union Army landed was in my hometown, Hampton, Virginia, at a place called Fort Monroe. At that time, 3 guys who were digging ditches for the Confederacy in Norfolk, Virginia, which is across a small body of water called the Hampton Roads, got in a rowboat and rowed to Fort Monroe and asked to be sheltered. General Benjamin Banks, who will be loathed for how he conducts himself in New Orleans later, just said, I think I'm not going to make them get sent back to their owners. They had been honoring the fugitive slave law up until that time. And if people escaped there, they let the owners come pick them up. He said, I'm going to declare them contraband of war, as they did with cows, horses, cannons, any kind of supplies. If they won a battle, all the materiel that belonged to the other side would be called contraband. So these human beings were known as contrabands at the time. It's kind of a controversial term now, but the people I know in Virginia who are descendants of the original contrabands like the name, and they refer to their ancestors as contrabands. So I tend to use the term because they do, but it turned out that nobody knew how many of these people were going to leave where they were. a year later, after these first three guys were accepted to stay in the fort, there were 10,000 fugitives from slavery in that area, right around that fort. This is a town that normally had 1,500 people or 2,000 max, and this happened all down the East Coast. I'm not going to show you every stop on that journey, but I'm starting with Virginia because they were the first to start organizing. The counties on the far left are tobacco counties. There are more to the west, but that's where huge numbers of laborers were. In the eastern part of Virginia, they were doing everything from oystering to raising tobacco to raising, in the immediate area, they were raising vegetables and food that people would buy and eat. The organizing that started there, the blue counties are where they first managed to elect people to office. You'll see most of them had one representative. So these counties continued to elect people. The western part of the state has never elected black officials yet. So this is still the heart when you see on TV during an election, the Democratic vote swaying Virginia. It's only around Arlington and these areas that I'm showing you that are in blue, the ones nearest to the East Coast that they're actually referring to. In Virginia, also they set a trend that applies to almost all of these places. They organized in their own county and then they went next door. All the green counties are the second place where they actually elected officials. The yellow counties are bordering, and the ones in Virginia on the left in particular are white majority counties. Throughout all of these maps, you'll see the yellow counties where they lose representation are next to all white majority counties and counties where they're never going to elect anybody because the violence stems from those white majority counties on the west in the case of Virginia. The biggest black majority population is in that area where it says Amelia number 6. They were not, even though they were a black majority county, they were still subject to so much violence that they were not able to elect officials the first time out. This is what happens to, okay, let me, Sorry, I'm trying to, I've forgotten which thing I'm supposed to use here. Okay, so this is what happens in all the southern states. It is what happens by 1890s, 1900. What caused the difference? Grandfather clauses at first, and then constitutional tests, and then poll taxes, and they continued passing laws because once they started to shrink the black vote, nobody in the legislature was happy. They wanted to take it to 0. So they kept, and this happens across the South, they kept thinking of new ways to eliminate people like my dad who could read and was going to study the Constitution to pass the test. So they kept at it until they hit 0. So I tell my students, because I live in one of the most gerrymandered states, I think the most gerrymandered state in the country, I tell them they're not trying to trim your vote, they're trying to get rid of it. So, oh, okay. We're gonna, North Carolina is the next place the Union troops came, and this map is a little bit surprising in that this area is what became known in the 20th century as the Black Second. In other words, the black electoral power was up here on the border with Virginia. And why was that? There were people who came from freed families who owned land. This is where the center of black power was in the state of North Carolina. The other center is here, where they had the famous Wilmington riot in the 1890s in order to wipe out the last of black office holders, and they destroyed the black community there. But these were the two centers of activism. People like over here were way more vulnerable. Let's see if I can. So this is how it kind of progresses in North Carolina. The other thing they're going to do, wherever you see the green and yellow in a lot of the states, they just divide the county in half so that the black majority is lost. This is the result in North Carolina. South Carolina was an exception. South Carolina and Mississippi were an exception to the rule because they had black majorities. Mississippi had a narrow black majority. South Carolina had an overwhelming one. So in this particular state, they were able to elect people except for those two northwestern counties. Wherever you are in the South, on the eastern coast, on the far western counties are up near Appalachia, and they never get black people elected there. UL also indicates that the Union Link, who were activists for the Republican Party, were there assisting. They did things like help negotiate labor contracts for people who couldn't read and write, and they also learned a lot about having meetings in secret and having armed people outside your meetings if you were black and trying to organize. So there was a lot of violence in that state. You'll see there was no violence on the Atlantic coast, and that's because it was overwhelmingly black. In most of the states that I mapped, that's where it starts, usually on a coastline, whether it's the Mississippi or the Gulf or the Atlantic. It's where the Union troops landed, and there was some modicum of slavery, although in North Carolina they were rushing around avoiding Confederates who came pretty close to the coast throughout the war. But in South Carolina, there was a lot of violence. All those northern counties were put under martial law because of the violence. So you can just see where the violence started, where the successful violence started. I wanted to show one last thing. They had people who held on to office till almost the turn of the century, but they had to switch parties to stay in office. This is actually the other way that the black vote was defeated in the state. These I just put this in there as an idea of what happened in all of these states. Suddenly, in the late 1800s, there were a lot of new counties called Robert E. Lee. And in this one, they tried to divide the coastline, which had a lot of black majority counties and communities. They never came down there to do a lot of violence. They had to cross through too many counties that were heavily black in order to do so, and it would be difficult to get away if they did do it. So there was, outside of the city of Charleston, there was relatively little violence that those people faced on the coast because of their numbers. But they did divide the biggest black county, which was around Beaufort, and began to disempower people very methodically. But this map is a kind of good example of where people today got the idea about how to counteract black mobilization and voting. Oops, okay. Try to find a fast way to do this. I'm just going to show you Florida. It's really an exception to the rule, but all of the issues they have in Florida today come from exactly this time period. Okay, yes. Florida had a very small population. Most of the black people who were there who ran towards the U.S. Navy, which was up at the northeastern part of the state, were there knocking down trees. Florida had not been cleared yet. There were a lot of enslaved people in the northern counties because planters in Georgia were hiding them there during the war. So as soon as people heard that the Navy was going to show up, they started to run. They had a black majority, electoral majority. The first thing that happened was 5 different groups tried to fight over that vote, and 2 of them were trying to minimize that vote. They ended up passing laws actually weighting white majority counties or counties that were black and white. If they were black majority, they were weighting them in the opposite way so that this black majority vote could not choose who was going to run the state. They invented a lot of laws with heavy penalties, including like interracial sex you could be fined $1,000 or $2,000 in an era when people made about $200 a year. And jail time for 10 years and losing the vote. So they sort of inaugurated the idea of associating jail time and being disfranchised. Okay. Oops. Alabama is, in the 1800s, much what it was in the 1960s. The Black Belt was so-called named that because of the black soil, but it is also where the black majority in the state was producing cotton. They organized across the state. You can't see it, but there's a rail line that goes across the state. The rail line was destroyed quite a few times to keep the Confederacy from moving iron ore and things like that, and weapons. But there are people across this area. Places like Birmingham don't exist yet, and they haven't discovered all the ore that there is going to create the steel industry. So these people were heavily organized. John Lewis was from Pike County. Is this thing working? Okay. Just below Montgomery, Alabama, that blue county. He was from Pike County, and I was amazed to discover on Skip Gates' show that he had no idea his great-grandparents had voted, but they found the records. But that's kind of what happened. They didn't elect somebody in that county, but there are some people who across the country don't know their ancestors voted. But in Alabama, the idea of activism really got embedded in the soil, so to speak, and they have been organizing across these counties ever since. So about 10 years ago, the governor of Alabama closed all the motor vehicle departments on that line across the middle of the Black Belt. That was simply to keep people from getting ID to vote. It didn't last but about 3 weeks, but it is still, and the Mobile is also a place that had really heavy organizing. So in Alabama, they've been fighting a very fierce fight for a long time. I'm going to go to the last one, which is Louisiana because it's kind of unusual. We tend to think of, okay. We tend to think of Louisiana a certain kind of way, but in terms of electoral politics, the power in Louisiana was in the sugar parishes, where the most of black people were working. You'll see in this map that Orleans County sends 35 people to the legislature, but shortly thereafter, that number is going to drop to 2. So there, in those blue counties to the west of New Orleans, St. Martin, Baton Rouge, Iberville, Pointe Coupé, Feliciana, those counties get divided into west and east early on to divide the black vote and blend white voters into what were black voting strongholds. Over time, those sugar workers who are also organized around labor issues hold on to power while politics wipes out all the power holders that were in New Orleans. People are fleeing the sugar counties also to get to New Orleans, but early on they started just forcing those people back to the plantations, and they invented a pass system so that they could make people go back to the countryside. But these parishes, because they stayed organized for so long, were able to vote and elect people longer. When this all comes to an end, they are going to be the source of exodusters, the exoduster movement. This is also true with Arkansas, which I'm not going to show you, but this is just an idea of what I was looking at in terms of not just looking on paper and saying they organized this county, but looking at it on a map and seeing that, oh, they organized the county next door also. And that is really how they did it. They went by boat, by horse, and by wagon to these other counties. In Florida, the representatives all represented 2 or 3 counties, which meant they traveled hundreds of miles by horse in order to go to rallies and inform the public of what they were doing in the legislature or what organizing needed to still be done. So it's quite massive what they were able to accomplish with 90% of the population unable to read and write. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview of your work. I'm just going to maybe level set a few facts about the overall context and check in with you and see if I'm getting it right. And then I have some questions I want to ask as well. So we have the actual proclamation, 1863. You know, we mark the history of Juneteenth as going to 1865, so as being, you know, the last place that word, or at least official word, reaches in Galveston, Texas. But it strikes me, and this is incredibly thorough, and the amount of research that must have gone into this is incredible. But basically, you're unpacking for us, by looking at the state of elected representatives, what happens next and how seriously does this country take emancipation. It feels like, you know, up to about maybe 1874, there seems to be, I'm going to call it progress. You can tell me if I'm right or not. But then the forces that were there before, the forces of slavery, make themselves manifest in actual laws and in actual attempts to slice and dice districts, and you end up being able to tell us a story with those yellow and blue diagrams where any of that progress on the representative and elective front is effectively nullified or eliminated
Right.
in these southern states.
Yeah, they invent all the tools people use today in order to repress the vote, and they looked at the maps. They looked at their maps, and they had a lot of violence as a tool to effect those changes. But I would say what helps them in the 1880s as they start to pass more peculiar laws to keep people from voting was the open embrace of white supremacy as a cultural idea throughout the South. The newspapers in the 1880s were advocating, we need white supremacy. This also fuels the need they felt for segregation, to physically segregate people. The freed people set up schools. They tried in most states to set up integrated schools. In Alabama, for instance, they just didn't write into the Constitution whether they were going to be segregated or not. And segregation was a new thing because enslaved people had been segregated on plantations, not they weren't on streetcars. So they're also responding to people trying to enforce ideas like all the kids can go to the same public schools, that kind of thing. So segregation becomes another tool. The idea that people would be horrified to have to sit next to a black person someplace. And middle-class people in New Orleans go after opera houses and concert halls because they want to go to restaurants and stuff. And working-class people, such as the washerwomen Tara Hunter writes about in Georgia, are trying to desegregate streetcars that all the workers take to work. And the streetcars don't even go to their neighborhoods. They still have to walk a long way when they get off of them. But they did several attempts to strike streetcars in the 1860s, 70s, long before Rosa Parks. It was a black female tradition to try to integrate railroad cars. So Ida B. Wells did it. Also, Du Bois and Booker T. Washington did it. But that notion also led to labor organizing. So the washerwomen originally organized to raise their fees, and they wanted everybody in Atlanta to agree to pay them 10 cents more. So they waited till an expo was getting ready to open for the first time in Atlanta, and they went on strike, meaning the hotels would not have tablecloths or bedding, et cetera. This went on for a long time. They arrested some of them. They put a couple of them on chain gangs, which was even then illegal it was illegal to put women on chain gangs. And they justified it by saying, oh, women means white women and female means black. So these are females. So they inspired all the waiters in town to go on strike and people who worked in hotels. And so they had linked citizenship with the ability to make a decent living.
And you've now taken us into the realm of labor, because I think, you know, I don't want to get too far into the book at this point, but basically the organizing that was happening during this time period, because representation didn't just happen. This was actually the power of community and the power of organizing. Later, that becomes the roots, or maybe even at that time becomes the roots of the labor movement, because, well, I'll let you take it from there in terms of the connections.
Well, one of the first things they needed was to negotiate labor contracts with the people who had been slave owners. Whether they had worked for those people or not, if they'd moved, they still had a similar setup was offered to them, and sharecropping hadn't yet been invented. But the Union League guys who were in places like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, where they had to work very, very secretively, they found that the freed people wanted their assistance to negotiate labor contracts as much as they wanted to know all their rights as citizens with regard to voting and stuff like that. So those guys did that, and they were as anxious to learn what their rights would be as workers, and those rights were very limited compared to today. But they helped give us some of the protections that we have now because they had already been exposed to the worst labor conditions ever, getting beat on the job, being burned on the job, strung up and killed on the job. They were very aware of things like violence in the workplace, and they were very aware that there would be such a thing as when women entered the workplace, some versions of assault would probably be an issue. They had already experienced that. Most white women were not in the workplace. If they were doing laundry, they worked out of home. In the North, it's different, but in the South, white women are, after the war, going to be single heads of household without the legal authority to be a head of household. But if they were widows, that was their situation. So they're coming into the realization that I need to be able to make the decisions about what happens to my children. And for black women, that was really problematic because they passed a lot of laws to indenture their children. They were called apprenticeships, but a former slave owner could go to a judge, say, I should have this woman's children, she doesn't know how to take care of them, and they would get a court order that they could use those children until they were 18 years old if they were females and 21 if they were males.
So pieces of slavery continue to manifest, even though, yes, people are being paid, but there's no such thing as minimum wage at this point. It's perhaps subsistence living at best.
Yeah, and most people were trying to get a piece of land to raise food on themselves and be in charge of how they were going to make money and also how they were going to get their kids in school. So it's a point at which they, like black women, enter the work world as free agents almost instantly, but it awakens them to issues that the American public isn't going to worry about for another 50, 60 years. They're sort of the vanguard, the advanced troops to certain aspects of functioning in society that we take for granted now. But luckily, they went to court about it so that a black woman was the first person to go to court about domestic violence. Her plea was ignored for, 40 years, something like that. But same thing with all the issues with women working in the workplace and being heads of household. Women were technically property at the time.
So we have the 15 years of somewhat progress, the good side of the beginnings of Reconstruction, which then manifests into these whole set of laws and Jim Crow laws and other things that really there are through lines to right up to the 1960s, if not today. So I wonder if we could turn to the title in this context, because Emancipation, not just a proclamation, but this is a journey, a process, and not just a series of events. And then I'd like to unpack the circuit, the notion of circuit in the title as well.
It's around this time that they invent the term CC rider. The older people in the audience may recognize it from rock and roll, but circuit rider. Abraham Lincoln was a circuit rider as a lawyer. It was a 19th century term for somebody who's on horseback going from county to county to do whatever they do. Mostly ministers were circuit riders. In the blues era, which is going to emerge after Reconstruction, they refer to certain men who were great, what should I call them? Who had a reputation for having a lot of women in their lives. They became called, the blues singers started to call them circuit riders too. But literally, the Emancipation Circuit people were circuit riders, and they had a certain circuit that they worked, whether they were Northerners or local people. Generally, a local circuit rider might be a minister who would go from Macon down to the 2 counties south of Macon. But in each of those places, he would have written in advance and say, please try to introduce me to somebody who will be a good leader in your community. He would then train that person, come back 3 weeks later to see how they were doing, and tell that person to start to build an organization in that county. And then they tried organizing meetings where there'd be people from more than one county. So one of my revelations in reading the accounts people left of doing that work was that as particularly the Northerners, some of them were born in the South and had escaped and gone north, but one of the things that astounded them was to go to a meeting, and they would be outside if it was hot, and there were no buildings in most of these towns big enough to hold 3,000 people. So they would go to a meadow, and there would be 3,000 black people and armed black people guarding the perimeter of the meeting where they were going to speak. And so they, particularly the AME ministers, would give them a lesson plan, so to speak. And the idea was to get people to memorize it, because this population doesn't read and write. At least 90% of them did not. So everybody's committing everything to memory, which also, in a sense, protects them from people knowing what the contents of their meetings are, or finding paperwork or whatever. And so they would ask a local person to add something to the circuit, another spot to the circuit. And they went back and checked up, but these guys did a lot of traveling. It's just kind of amazing. And they were often, particularly if they were from the north, they had never seen 3,000 black people before, so they would be rather thrilled to go to these rallies. And their letters are very emotional. They were moved by seeing the poor condition of the lives of the people who came to these meetings. They could see people didn't have enough food, and they were moved by by their testimony at meetings where they were processing things that had happened in slavery. They were moved by the fact that people understood the economy of slavery, like, yeah, our owners sold every girl child of my mother's except me, because the war came along. They had grievances about the treatment of their mothers, if their mothers were beaten or whatever, and anybody, including children, could give testimony at those meetings. So they had this opportunity to conceptualize the idea of a we that included millions, but also a we where they could process trauma.
I did listen to some of your conversation last night as well. And I do want to ask about how easy or difficult it was to research this project, because this is a time where I'm unclear about how much was documented and what stories could have been committed to writing. So maybe why don't we start with that, and then if there's a particular story that you would like to share with us today to give you a sense of what you read about, what you discovered.
Oh, okay. This is where I think being a poet is helpful. I read some of the same sources other people read, but I got moved by personal stories that may or may not have had anything to do with what I was tracking. Because any human testimony is going to digress. So, but I enjoyed the digression. So I ran across this guy in Texas who was talking about all the meteors overhead at the onset of the war, or just before the war started. And I had read an account from Walt Whitman about Abraham Lincoln going to the observatory in D.C., which he did all through the war, to check the stars. And then I discovered Harriet Tubman had been in the same meteor shower that Lincoln was in when he was 17 in Illinois, and Frederick Douglass in Maryland also saw, as a teenager, this same meteor shower. I say at the end of the book, these are three really dyed-in-the-wool optimists. They all took a good message from the meteor shower. But the public media was predicting the end of the world, floods, fires, all kinds of things. Everyone took it to be a sign of war. Some people described John Brown as the meteor that went across the skies just before the war. Another historian might not have paid any attention to who's watching the stars, but this guy in Texas said that the Confederates there were preparing for war, and they were hearing cannon fire for the first time. And because they'd never heard it and didn't quite know what it was, they called it man-made thunder. And the people on his plantation made up songs about the man-made thunder. And so for me, going in the archives, I feel like sometimes I'm encountering these interesting human beings who told these stories because they were aware that they had not ever been part of history. That they didn't, if they knew somebody who had been part of history, they told it to the interviewers, like, I was a slave in the plantation. One guy was a fiddler. He was at a plantation owned by the cousin of William Henry Harrison or somebody like that, and ended up going to the White House to play fiddle, but I'm reading him as a working man in Arkansas years later. And another guy who worked on a steamboat as a slave, he was some kind of servant on the boat. So he was seeing all the passengers going from New Orleans to Cincinnati or wherever. And he told the interviewer, I met 5 US presidents. He might have said 6. And I spent a couple of hours trying to figure out which presidents that could be over what time period. And I finally said he might have met 5. But they all had a sense of, as everybody does today, of, oh, someone's interviewing me. I have witnessed history. I may not be part of history in your mind, but I have witnessed history. And they all tried to talk about the 1 or 2 events in their lives where something happened that they knew had happened to thousands or millions of people. My favorite being, I found randomly 5 people in Virginia, some of them 5 counties away from each other, who all mentioned a certain blizzard. And blizzards don't happen in Virginia as a rule, they just don't. We used to pray for snow. But a doctor who had been the mayor of Petersburg died in the blizzard a mile from his front gate. He had taken a horse and buggy from Petersburg to wherever his farm was. One of the people I stumbled on worked in his house, and she's waiting for him at the front door. he's never going to get there. He's going to freeze to death a mile away and not in eye shot. So these people who live 5 counties away, who are enslaved, who don't get their own copy of the newspaper every day, told the interviewers, oh, that's the blizzard was named after this doctor, and I can't remember his name, but, oh, Dr. Johnson, you know, he was a terrible man. Oh, I hear he was a terrible drunk and very mean to everybody. And I'm like, there's a circuit of gossip, if nothing else. The grapevine in Virginia was really working, and each of these people talked about the doctor like they'd known him, and I was like, there's a kind of communication that is going on. So they tapped into that. They had heard about this historic thing, and so they told the interviewers, I didn't read 150 interviews. It may be that 25 people mentioned the blizzard, but that's kind of looking at the archive, just at the humanity of the people in the archive as well, and what they're trying to tell us.
Right, we get to know their stories, even if we don't know all their names, but they're more than just numbers or male or female, as they would have been classed much earlier too.
Yes, and they're sometimes very particular about telling you what name they used to have and what name they chose, or why they decided to go ahead and use the planter's name, things like that, which I didn't even imagine finding.
I think it's also interesting that, because you mentioned, I mean, we're in a library, the importance of reading and writing, many people could not or were banned from doing so, and yet you were able to demonstrate how powerful this oral means of communication, and then later things in writing that do in fact empower this circuit of organizing that is occurring.
Oh, yes, and one of the other, if I hadn't lived in segregation, I may still have thought of it, but I'm not sure. One of the things that helped them a lot was the invisibility of enslaved people. So right after the war, people are still not paying attention to a black person coming in the room. It's like if they've lived in a house where they notice people at dinner don't notice the servants bringing more water. They're not paying attention to those human beings. So it's my contention that one of the tools of the circuit was guys who loaded the railroads. They're going to be the first people to go on strike right in 1866 in Virginia. People who load trains of tobacco go on strike almost instantly. They get organized. They call themselves the mechanics of Richmond. And they get somebody to write down their demands. Some of them, they work a line that goes from Richmond in an arc across Virginia and then down into North Carolina, across to the Atlantic and up into Norfolk. That was the only way they could get the stuff to Norfolk where it was going to be loaded. So it went through, and they took on more tobacco in that Black County area in North Carolina. So if the same guy's on the train from Richmond to Norfolk and back, they are like the media of the times. They are passing the word. So when they went on strike, they passed the word orally down the line. So there were strikes down to Danville, and I just said, that means some human being told another human being. They weren't writing leaflets. And they were able to, in some places they were shot instantly, but they were able to put on, I don't know, 6 or 8 strikes in the first 2 years of freedom. And it meant that they were in touch with people in a whole other state. But nobody's noticing who the guy loading the tobacco hogheads is talking to. That's my contention about it, that nobody feels any need to pay attention to what those guys, even the guys on the dock, like who they're talking to. And they also really organized.
Amazing. Let's take a few questions from either the audience here in person or from online. I think we have a microphone roving. We do, Erica, thank you. And we can also listen to our online community if there are questions there too. Rita, would you introduce yourself as well?
I'm Marita Rivero. Thank you both. I'm just so interested in how the black codes that continue to stamp out any kind of activity, any kind of activism on the back in these communities you talk about, just work their way right into the legal system in the United States. I remember hearing you say something about someone who was still whipped in prison in 1960, let's say. So
Yes.
many of it's just the transition that seemed so invisible to me now has had so much detail from your work.
Yeah.
I went back and just thought about the conversations we're having now about the kind of racism sort of built into our legal code. We don't recognize it. It's just the way we think about things, the way housing works, the way.
Right.
I just think about you, the scholar, having to find out more and more and more and more and more until this blooms. Something must have gone off in your head as you process what you were seeing. I wonder whether you could talk a bit about kind of that, the lasting and almost impregnable legacy we have from just years of really intentional work on behalf of the black community that kind of disappeared from history and from memory.
Growing up in the South helped. People in my family had experienced the legacy of the voter repression methods, certainly segregation, stuff like that. The first time I had to go to New York by myself, I was about 14. My dad put me on the train and he said, sit in the colored car till you get to DC, then sit wherever you want. At Grand Central, get the A train, go to 135th Street and turn right. Now, he had been a Pullman porter, so he said, when he was in college, he worked as a Pullman porter in Summers, and he said, if there's a problem, get a Pullman porter. And then he said, most of them have PhDs anyway, they could help you. So that awareness of how to navigate, that there's ways to navigate in this world and not be hampered by the idea that not to lose sight of where you're going. So a couple years later, that was gone. And I think, so being a Southerner allowed me to keep my eyes open in a certain way. And as I said, being a poet keeps me interested in everybody's story. I'm always, so I spent hours also reading ads in newspapers for black events, because I was trying to see what were the other things black people were doing to get together. The first thing black people were trying to do coming out of slavery was go someplace else, just to see someplace different. A lot of people wanted to go to Memphis, for instance, who were in Arkansas. They'd heard about Memphis. So they're organizing church groups and trips. So black people are now credited for inventing the excursion. So they invented groups taking excursions together because they were so curious also to maybe see other family members and stuff like that. So what kind of got me was that one of my teachers said, lens of slavery to me, and I went, oh, that means you know that you can't just say somebody's free and then watch them starve, that they're not experiencing freedom. And they knew all these things that every displaced population knows today. They need shelter, they need food, they need medical care. And bless their hearts, freed people had people in their community who were not coherent to them, and they wanted mental health treatment also. They invented the first hospital for mental health in Virginia, which is still there. It's run by the state. And they invented one, at least in Louisiana and possibly other places, but they wanted the state to provide help for all people, and they had this idea that if the white population was educated through public schools for free, they would end up treating freed people better. And I now teach people who have not been taught their citizenship rights the way we used to learn in civics classes. They actually know less about what all their rights are as a citizen of this country than the freed people who were taught it systematically. So what I think happened is those people taught their children who taught their children, and we grew up in an environment where you were supposed to know what your rights were. Whereas today, we have millions of citizens who are not growing up in an environment where certain privileges are assumed to be theirs, but not really clear on the rights. So it's hard for them to connect those women who went to court in the 19th century with fights they're having now about the ability of women to be in charge of their lives. So they wouldn't make that connection. So
I also, I mean, in your opening comments, I mean, not to pick on Florida, but you used your analysis of that map to explain some of the socio-political challenges that exist on the electoral map, at least, if not in the actual society today.
oh yeah, and they defeated the black majority having control of the vote from the beginning. They never got to exercise their power, but yeah. There are people sitting around thinking about that. So my students are really great about voting, but I feel sometimes like I'm teaching them what I learned in the 8th grade about citizenship rights, because it's one of the tools that allows you to make up your own mind when you hear the news. If you don't know, then somebody can tell you, well, this is legal or this is illegal, and depending on if you like the person on TV saying it, maybe you'll believe them. So,
whether it be true or not.
true or not.
Are there any online questions? And we'll go 4 minutes after, because we started 5 minutes late, if that's okay. But if anyone does have to leave, feel free. But we'll go a couple minutes later. Erica?
Great. Thank you so much. So this is from Viola. And it's a rather lengthy question, but I'll kind of shorten it. Dr. Davis, how did your experience as a young child born in Hampton, Virginia, impact your career?
Oh, two ways. Storytelling on the porch, very important. I spent years listening to all my aunts and uncles telling stories, and my dad. But there were some things that hit me about it later. I went to school with 4 or 5 other kids named Armstead, and I was 35 years old before I found out that the people who owned my family were the Armsteads, and then I realized I had no idea why I was called Davis. I've done a whole book on it. I still don't know why we have the name Davis, but I did find out about the Armsteads. But on the other hand, my teachers went above and beyond to get us as far as we could get in terms of learning whatever it was they were teaching. And at the same time, the students at Hampton University started taking action about segregation. And so I usually tell people I got really empowered about age 11 because everybody I knew walked into town and down the main street. Me and my dad, everybody I was related to, everybody from my church, all my teachers, just everybody I knew as a child was in the street. And the people downtown were standing on the sidewalk like this. And I was like, wow, they're amazed at us. And we broke the segregation in our town also through the power of boycott. So I went from sitting in the balcony in the one theater that allowed colored people in as the colored section of the theater. And some of those businesses we put out of business because they couldn't survive without segregation, and they needed their black customers. And it's, next thing I knew, by the time I was 12 and 13, I was doing voter registration in DC, because DC wanted statehood even then. So I felt like people of all ages could be part of the process of making change. And I went to college in the 60s. We took over Columbia University. What can I say? It just kept going on. So I really feel like take your kids to the march. I would even say this is true of a lot of people I've met since from other places. I have a friend from Kentucky who just recently told me his grandmother took him to the march when King came to town, and that just totally got him straight that he was a powerful human being, and he was younger than I was when I did it.
We'll take a final question from the back, and then we'll close this part of our program. But thank you. Please wait for the microphone, because we have our online audience that needs to hear the question too. Thank you. Thanks, Erica.
Thank you for your remarks and your wealth of research. In light of all the work that you've done as we approach the elections of 2024, you know where this is going. What are you going to be looking for, and what should we be looking for? We know that there have been some court cases that have to do with the black vote in Selma, I believe, and in
Alabama.
in Charleston, yeah. So having to do with repressing the black vote, but what kind of signifiers should we be looking for?
I'm expecting the black voters to stomp on out there in great numbers. We've done it the last 2 times. We've done it when you couldn't have a bottle of water on the line in Georgia. I wrote a poem that's sort of comic about this woman who's still on the line waiting for the 40 acres and a mule. And they tell her she can't have a sandwich on the line, and she says, "You haven't thought of that yet. That's the 21st century." Because the one thing they didn't do in the 19th century was say you couldn't have water or food. But yeah, I think there will be a lot of energy around saving democracy. I think that's really the main job at this point.
Well, a wonderful note to end on, saving democracy. The book is The Emancipation Circuit, Black Activism Forging a Culture of Freedom. Please join me in thanking our partners at the Museum of African American History, our program team here, and of course our author, special guest, and Stone Book Award winner, Dr. Thulani Davis.
Thank you.
And there will be a short availability in the lobby with copies of the book available, and Dr. Davis will be available to sign. So thank you, and hope to see you again. Until next time, good evening.